I was sort of thinking maybe as a little review tonight to ask you to share some things maybe that God has been speaking to you about as we've been going through the studies. If some of you would like to, think especially of the men, if they would like to share some things, something that the Lord in particular has been speaking to you about as we've been going through the story. I'd like to call it the story, but it's true in every detail. Anything anybody would like to share?
This isn't new, except to emphasize it again that the consequences, God, first of all, does what he says he's going to do. We've seen that over and over, and that man's consequence, the consequences of man's actions follow him,
Right.
and come true as well. And so you have man, God showing he's always God, and man showing he's always man.
Okay, very good. Anybody else would like to share something?
I was listening through Numbers the other day because I was just driving most of the day. So I took you up on your challenge, read through the parts. But anyway, one of the things...
I hope you didn't hit anybody.
No, but I almost listened to the whole book of Numbers. It was really neat.
Right.
But the one thing that kept standing out to me is when God would tell them to do something, they would often say, "Oh, we can't. We can't do it." And then God would say, "Okay, well, you're not going to do it then." And then they would say, "Well, we want to now." And I was just like, in my life, maybe I would like to be quicker to not rely on my abilities or what I think are my abilities or my faith or whatever, and just say, "Okay, Lord, if you're asking me to do this, regardless of how I feel," because I go back to Moses, he didn't feel he was capable, but he obviously would have been with the Lord's help, that I would be quick to say, "Okay, let's do it." So the response of faith would just be simple, quick obedience to whatever God reveals. And then not be like working against God because I want to play catch up or I want to, let's go take the land.
Right.
But just be following the Lord and believing what the Lord is doing for me and through me and in me, and so see him work.
Okay. Anybody else?
I appreciated, especially when we were going through Jacob, how flawed he was, but how God still used him.
Okay, very good. What happens if God doesn't fulfill his word?
You're in trouble.
We're in trouble. We're in big trouble, aren't we? Okay? Anybody else would like to share something? Okay? If not, we'll continue on. I want to go back to the book of Deuteronomy again just for one verse. Something is very central, I'd say, is chapter 29, verse 29 of Deuteronomy. Excuse me. Somebody have that verse and would like to read it?
The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law.
The secret things belong to who?
Lord.
A lot of things he hasn't revealed yet, has he? But there are many things he has revealed, and we are responsible then for those things to communicate them to our children, as well to put them in practice, aren't they? Okay? Okay, we're in the book of Joshua. And We've gone through chapter 1 where God talks to Joshua, assures him that he's going to be with him as he was with Moses. By the way, how many times did God fail Moses?
None.
Although Moses did once, didn't he? And it caused him to not see the land. But God assures him that he's going to be with him as he was with Moses. Well, and then chapter 2, we're ready to do chapter 2, is when Joshua sends 2 men to spy out the city of Jericho. That's going to be the city that they're going to capture first, okay? And it says that apparently the men saw, the people from Jericho saw these 2 guys go into the harlot's house, Rahab, okay? And let's start reading with verse 3. And somebody start reading there, and I'll stop you every once in a while and make comments, okay? Chapter 2, verses 3.
Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, "True, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out, and I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them." But she had brought them up to the roof, and hid them with stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords, and the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers had gone out. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men,
Okay, now listen carefully what she says. Remember, this is 40 years after the first time they were to go in. So remember that with the things that she's saying. What does she say in verse 9?
And she said to the men, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you."
Okay, I want to ask you a question. Had she seen what God did?
She just heard.
Just heard. Now, their fear was 40 years later. What was their fear back 40 years ago?
Is it the plagues?
When they first saw it, their fear would have been greater. But now, 40 years later, they're still talking about that fear, aren't they? Keep reading.
"For we heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, who you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you."
By the way, were they ready to be conquered back there 40 years ago? But why weren't they? Because Israel didn't believe, did they? Okay? I want somebody to read somebody read Exodus chapter 9, verse 16. Exodus 9, verse 16, sorry. And then also chapter 15, verses 14 through 16. Now remember, this is what, the first one here in Exodus 9 is what God said to Pharaoh. And what did he say there in chapter 9, verse 16?
"But for this purpose I have raised you up, to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth."
Was it being proclaimed? Here clear up in Jericho. 40 years later, they were still fearful because it was coming to pass as God said it would. Now chapter 15, verses 14 through 16. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe this is a song that they sang after they crossed the Red Sea. Okay? What does those verses say?
"The peoples have heard, they tremble. Pangs have seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Now are the chiefs of Edom dismayed. Trembling seizes the leaders of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them because of the greatness of your arm. They are still as a stone, till your people, O Lord, pass by, till the people pass by whom you have purchased.
By the way, what are they singing?
Like about, or
Well, what are they singing about there?
oh, the Jericho,
Yeah.
or anyone that hears about them.
Anyone that hears about them.
Yeah.
And they were singing about that, but when they came the first time to go in, what happened?
So they're giants. We can't go in.
Okay. You see what happens many times to us, folks? Many times. When we face difficulties, and I'm saying we because I do the same thing. Okay. But it was all prepared really back for them to go in, back at that time. So anyway, she said, for the Lord your God, this is verse 11 now in chapter 2 of Joshua, for the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. Now remember, these were idolatrous people. But what they had heard was enough to at least convince this one woman of who God really was, wasn't it? It convinced her. Okay? And so she asked for a token. She says, please save my life when you come in. And the men said, yes, we will. And those who are in your house, we will save you. But if anybody goes out, when we come in, we're not responsible for them. You have to be in your house. And then they tied the red cord with which she let them down, tied that cord in the window, the red or crimson cord. Please keep that in mind, okay? And then it says, and they got back to in verse 23 and 24, what does it say there? Of Joshua chapter 2, 23 and 24.
Then the two men returned. They came down from the hills and passed over, and came to Joshua the son of Nun. And they told him all that had happened to them. And they said to Joshua, truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us.
How's that translation go? What does it say there, last part?
And all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us.
Oh, melt away. Okay, it says here faint away. About the same idea, isn't it? Okay? Now they come to chapter 3, quickly, and that's when they cross the River Jordan. What's the difference between the River Jordan and the Red Sea? Really, the sea is not red. It's called the Salt Sea, really what it should be translated, I believe. But anyway, what's the difference between a river and the Red Sea? What is the difference?
One's moving.
One's moving, and one's deeper than the other, isn't it? Okay? But look what it says here in verse 15 of chapter 3. When is it they were going to cross over?
The river. Jordan River.
Yeah. What does it say about the river at that time?
You want me to read it?
Yeah.
Okay. And as soon as those bearing the ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water, now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest. The waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan. And those flowing down toward the Sea of the Arabah and the Salt Sea were completely cut off, and the people passed over opposite Jericho. Now the priest bearing the ark of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan.
Again, approximately how many people crossed?
3 million.
Close to 3 million people. Okay? Chapter 4. They had to leave some stones there as a sign so that when their children would see these stones by the river, they could ask their parents what are these about, and they could tell them what it was for. Okay? Chapter 4. And it says here in verse 10, what does it say in verse 10 of chapter 4, Dave?
For the priests which bare the ark stood in the midst of Jordan until everything was finished, that the Lord commanded Joshua to speak unto the people according to all that Moses commanded Joshua, and the people hasted and passed over.
I want to ask you a question. If you were standing there and going across there, would you have tried to hurry? But it says that they didn't. They stood there waiting until they put those stones there, left that mark, and then finally they went across. Again, God is not in a hurry how he does things, does he? He's not in a hurry, okay? And so when we read the last verses 23 and 25, what does it say there, Dave?
For the Lord your God dried up the waters of Jordan from before you until ye passed over, as the Lord your God did into the Red Sea, when he dried up from before us until we were gone over. Then that all the people of the earth might know the hand of the Lord that is mighty, that ye might fear the Lord your God forever.
Okay? So in other words, it was to cause people to fear the Lord, wasn't it? Okay? Now, quickly, chapter 5. And when we read that, verse 1, what does it say verse 1 there, Dave?
And it came to pass, when all the kings of the Amorites, which were on the side of Jordan westward, and all the kings of the Canaanites, which were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of Jordan from before the children of Israel until they were passed over, that their heart melted, neither was their spirit in them any more, because of the children of Israel.
Did God have everything planned? He sure did, didn't he? Okay? Now let's jump over here where they had to do circumcision because all those years they were wandering, apparently didn't circumcise the children. And so when you get down to verse 12, what happens there in verse 12?
And the manna ceased on the morrow after they had eaten of the old corn of the land, neither had the children of Israel manna any more, but they did eat of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year.
By the way, what was Israel's complaint when they were in the desert? Remember what they complained about?
They loathed this light manna.
Yeah. In other words, if they would have gone in the first time 40 years ago, what would have happened to manna?
It would have stopped.
But because of God's grace, wasn't it? He continued to give them manna in spite of their unbelief. What about the greatness of our God? Isn't he something? It really causes us to think. Okay? So anyway, Joshua then meets up with the captain, which was really the Lord, in verse 14. And he said, Nay, but as the captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and did worship, and said unto him, What saith the Lord unto thy servant? Okay? All right? Chapter 6 now. It's going to be strange here. Because how many of you ever seen something conquered by going around in circles? Okay? So let's start reading here. Verse 5, brother, would you start with verse 5? Now, God has called them to, they're going to have to do runs around the city of Jericho, around the walls, one a day for 6 days, and then on the seventh day, they're to go around 7 days. So let's see what happens here.
In verse 5?
Yes.
And it shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up every man straight ahead. So Joshua the son of Nun called the priest and said to them, Take up the ark of the covenant, and let the 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord. Then he said to the people, Go forward and march around the city, and let the armed men go on before the ark of the Lord. And it was so, that when Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. And the armed men went before the priest who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark while they continued to blow the trumpets.
Okay, I have a question. What do you think the people in Jericho are thinking right now?
These people are crazy.
Yeah, maybe we shouldn't have been afraid of them. They're just going around and around, aren't they? Okay? But it's interesting how God does things. By the way, looking at this from the point of view of man, this looks kind of crazy, doesn't it? But you know something? God does not think like we do. He does not think like we do. So anyway, when we come down here to the last day, they had to go 7 times around. And it says here in verse 16 and 17 and 18. Somebody read that for me, please.
And it came about at the 7th time, when the priests blew the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And the city shall be under the ban. It and all that is in it belongs to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But as for you, only keep yourselves from the things under the ban, lest you covet them and take some of the things under the ban.
Okay, what is God telling the people to do here?
Destroy everything.
But they were to keep certain things, weren't they? But that was for who?
The Lord.
That was for the Lord. They were not to touch a thing, were they? Okay? Now let's see here what happens here in verse 20 through 21. What happens here?
So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown, and as soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. Then they devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, with the edge of the sword.
Okay, keep reading.
But to the 2 men who had spied out the land, Joshua said, Go into the prostitute's house and bring out from there the woman and all who belong to her, as you swore to her. So the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her. And they brought all her relatives and put them outside the camp of Israel. And they burned the city with fire and everything in it. Only the silver and the gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put in the treasury of the house of the Lord. But Rahab the prostitute and her father's household and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. And she has lived in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Joshua laid on an oath on them at that time, saying, Cursed before the Lord be the man who raises up and rebuilds this city Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land.
Okay? Great the conquering, wasn't it? Now remember, Jericho was a great city at that time. A big city. Chapter 7, verse 1. What is the first word there? I don't know if it says in your version.
But
Let's go back to
the
Genesis
people.
chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3. In Spanish, verse 1 says, pero. That means but. Everything was going fine, but. Keep that in mind, please, for something later on, okay? Okay, back to Joshua chapter 7. What does it say there in verse 1?
But the people of Israel broke faith in regard to the devoted things. For Achan the son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of the devoted things. And the anger of the Lord burned against the people of Israel.
Keep reading.
Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth-aven, east of Bethel, and said to them, Go up and spy out the land. And the men went up and spied out Ai. And they returned to Joshua and said to him, Do not have all the people go up, but let about 2,000 or 3,000 men go up and attack Ai. Do not make the whole people toil up there, for they are few.
Okay, what do you think is entering into the people now?
Confidence.
Self-confidence. Why? They've seen a great city fall, haven't they? But now this is just a small place. Let's not send everybody up. That's what they're saying. We're going to find out what's going to happen later on. Okay? Keep that in mind. All right? What has happened in verse 4?
So about 3,000 men went up from the people, and they fled before the men of Ai. And the men of Ai killed about 36 of their men, and chased them before the gate as far as Shebarim, and struck them at the descent. And the hearts of the people melted and became as water. Then
Wow. What?
Israel's hearts are melting.
And because of what? One person. Please keep that in mind. One person. Okay? So Joshua, when he sees that, he tears his clothes in verse 6, and he falls before the Lord. And he says, Lord, what's going to happen? In verse 9 he says, For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land shall hear of it, and shall surround us and cut off our name from the earth. And what wilt thou do unto thy great name? Then what does God say to Joshua in verse 10?
Get up, why have you fallen on your face?
Interesting. In other words, there's a time for prayer, but there's a time for not pray. Because he says, don't fall on your face. There's something wrong here. Okay? Keep going.
Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant that I commanded them. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen and lied and put them among their own belongings. Therefore the people of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. They turn their backs before their enemies because they have become devoted for destruction. I will be with you no more unless you destroy the devoted things from among you.
It's interesting that he says Israel, but how many sinned? By the way, we as believers, are we one body? But one person does it affect the rest of the body? Please keep that in mind. Very important, okay? Keep reading.
Get up, consecrate the people, and say, Consecrate yourselves for tomorrow. For thus says the Lord, God of Israel, there are devoted things in your midst, O Israel. You cannot stand before your enemies until you take away the devoted things from among you.
Okay? Now drop down to verse 16.
So Joshua rose early in the morning and brought Israel near, tribe by tribe, and the tribe of Judah was taken. And he brought near the clans of Judah, and the clan of the Zerahites was taken. And he brought near the clan of Zerahites man by man, and Zabdi was taken. And he brought near his household man by man, and Achan the son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, the tribe of Judah, was taken. Then Joshua said to Achan, My son, give glory to the Lord God of Israel, and give praise to him, and tell me now what you have done. Do not hide it from me.
Do you remember a verse that says, He that covereth his sins shall not prosper? And what was Achan doing? hiding his sin. And I imagine when Joshua started calling them by name, somebody started trembling. Trembling? How do you say
Trembling?
it? Trembling, that's what I wanted to say, okay? Sorry about that, okay? And so what does he say in verse 20?
And Achan answered Joshua, "Truly I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and this is what I did. When I saw among the spoil a beautiful cloak from Shinar, and 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, then I coveted them and took them. And see, they are hidden in the earth inside my tent, with the silver underneath."
By the way, what was Eve's fall? She saw, she coveted, and she took. Interesting. The very same thing, okay? And so Joshua sends messengers, and they find these things. And then he says to Achan here in verse 25, what does he say?
And Joshua said, "Why did you bring trouble on us? The Lord brings trouble on you today." And all Israel stoned him with stones. They burned them with fire and stoned them with stones. And they raised over him a great heap of stones that remains to this day. Then the Lord turned from his burning anger. Therefore, to this day, the name of the place is called the Valley of Achor.
Okay? So, when they got rid of the trouble, then God says, now, go in. But look at what's happening here. In verse 1 of chapter 8, what does he say to Joshua?
Do not fear and do not be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you.
Take how many?
All of them.
We catching that? What happened the first time?
3,000.
But God said all of them, didn't he? We catching what's happening? Okay, but also verse 2, what does it say?
And you shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king. Only its spoil and its livestock you shall take as plunder for yourselves. Lay an ambush against the city behind it.
What would have happened had Achan waited?
He would have gotten some spoil.
He could have gotten a lot more than just a little bit of he took, didn't he? But because he didn't believe God, he went ahead. He lost everything. Even his family and all that he had was destroyed. Are we catching it? Is sin important to God? I hope we really let that sink into our hearts, folks. Very, very important. When you think of all the riches that were there, he took just a little bit, but the very fact that he disobeyed God was enough to bring defeat to his whole family and all that he had. Okay? So anyway, they go up to the city and they conquer it. And verse 25 now. What does verse 25 say?
And all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. But Joshua did not draw back his hand with which he stretched out the javelin until he had devoted all the inhabitants of Ai to destruction.
Because he had destroyed everything there as God had said, okay? Chapter 9. Something interesting happens here, and we need to really pay attention to this here. Verse 1. Who can help me, please?
As soon as all the kings who were beyond the Jordan, in the hill country, and the lowland, all along the coast of the great sea towards Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, heard of this, they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they on their part acted with cunning and went and made ready provisions and took worn-out sacks for their donkeys and wine skins, worn out, and torn and mended, with worn out patched sandals on their feet and worn out clothes, and all their provisions were dry and crumbly. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, "We have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us." But the men of Israel said to the Hivites, "Perhaps you live among us. Then how can we make a covenant with you?" They said to Joshua, "We are your servants." And Joshua said to them, "Who are you, and where do you come from?"
Okay, he asked them two questions, and what were those questions?
Who are you, and where do you come from?
Okay, who are you, and where did you come from? Now let's see if they answer those questions. This is very important, okay? So what happens here in verse 9?
They said to him, "From a distant country your servants have come, because of the name of the Lord your God. For we have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt."
The word had got around, hadn't it? What God had done to the people in Egypt, okay? Keep reading.
"And all that he did in to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and the king of Heshbon, and to Og king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country said to us, 'Take provisions in your hand for the journey, and go to meet them, and say to them, We are your servants. Come now, make a covenant with us. Here's our bread. It was still warm from when we took it out from our houses, as our food for the journey on the day we set out to come to you. But now, behold, it is dry and crumbly. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and behold, they have burst. And these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey.' So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel for the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them, and made a covenant with them, to let them live. And the leaders of the congregation swore to them."
Okay. I want to ask you a question. Does everything get worn out by a long journey?
It didn't for Israel.
It sure didn't, did it? But look what they did here. But it's an interesting thing here in verse 14. It says, "And the men took up their provisions and asked not counsel at the mouth of the Lord." That was a fatal mistake, wasn't it? Sure was. And they depended upon their own understanding. What does Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 say? Anybody remember what those verses are?
Lean not on your own understanding.
Yep.
In all your ways acknowledge him, he will make your paths straight.
Okay. Lean not unto your own understanding. And this is what they were doing here, weren't they? Okay?
Dave, they also did that at Ai. Achan was part of the problem, but another part of the problem was that they were depending on their own. They didn't consult the Lord.
That's right, exactly. They should have taken the whole army, but they only took 2,000 or 3,000. Exactly. That's the thing that goes on all over, isn't it? Every time we see defeat, it's because man has put his trust in himself rather than the Lord. Very good. Thank you, Dave. All right. So what happens here in verse 16? We want to finish this chapter if we can before we leave this evening. Okay. Verse 16. Who has the microphone? Okay.
At the end of 3 days after they had made a covenant with them, they heard that they were their neighbors and that they lived among them. And the people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Chephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath-jearim. But the people of Israel did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. And all the congregation murmured against the leaders. But all the leaders said to all the congregation, "We have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we may not touch them."
Okay. Let's go to Psalm chapter 15, please, for 1 minute. Psalm 15. Somebody read verses 1 through 5.
O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill?
Okay. Number 1, he says what? In verse 2. What's the first thing he says? Keep reading.
He who walks blamelessly and does what is right, and speaks the truth in his heart.
Okay.
Who does not slander with his tongue, and does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friend. In whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord. Who swears to his own hurt and does not change. Who does not put out his money at interest, and does not take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved.
Verse 4, the very last part, what does it say there? He that sweareth to his own hurt, and what?
Does not change.
This is what Joshua is doing, isn't he? He's realized he's done wrong, but he's not going to change. This is very important. A very important principle that we're learning here, okay? And so, verse 20 says, what does verse 20 say now in Joshua chapter 9?
This we will do to them. Let them live, lest wrath be upon us, because of the oath that we swore to them. And the leaders said to them, let them live. So they became cutters of wood and drawers of water for all the congregation, just as the leaders had said of them. Joshua summoned them, and he said to them, why did you deceive us, saying, we are very far from you, when you dwell among us? Now therefore you are cursed. Some of you shall never be anything but servants, cutters of wood, and drawers of water for the house of my God. They answered Joshua, because it was told your servants for a certainty that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. So we feared greatly for our lives because of you, and did this thing. And now behold, we are in your hand. Whatever seems good and right in your sight to do to us, do it. So he did this to them, and delivered them out of the hand of the people of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day cutters of wood and drawers of water for the congregation, and for the altar of the Lord to this day, in the place that he should choose.
Okay, thank you. We're going to stop there because chapter 10 continues with the same people. But it's interesting what's going to happen. Okay?
Interesting, the difference. Rahab said, I know you're going to destroy the land, save me. So she just asked for mercy.
Right.
And they said, we're going to be killed. Let's see if we can deceive them.
Right.
But they could have maybe asked to be saved. I don't know if the grace of God would have,
Right. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a good question. Thank you
Yeah.
for bringing that up. That's one of those unseen things that belongs to the Lord, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Dave, can I make one comment?
Sure.
Going back to the story of Rahab, I was asked a number of years ago about this. Rahab lies a number of times in that story. And the question that was asked me was this: does that justify lying? Does that justify what we call situation ethics, which means that it's okay to do bad things if there's a good purpose to be gained by it? And I think the answer is this. No, first of all, lying is always wrong. But Rahab was responding to the little bit of light that she had.
Right, exactly.
And, she was responding to the fact that she had heard that she did fear the Lord. Now she's taken into the nation of Israel, and she ends up in the genealogy of Christ.
Yes, believe
But
it or
along
not.
the line, she would have learned that thou shalt not bear false witness. But it doesn't make it right. It's just that she was operating on what light she had at the time.
Right, exactly. Thank you, Dave, for bringing that up. I was going to mentioned something like that too. But that was very, very important. Very, very important. So I think we get a lot of things to learn, don't we? A lot of things that the Lord has for us. And I just appreciate so much you folks giving me the time to be able to share the study, because this is what we've done for many, many years, and it's been such a blessing all the places we've done it. So, mentioning what Dave said about Rahab, what about Jacob?
Jacob knew better.
Yeah, he sure did. And we talk about in the line of Christ, you know, if God wasn't merciful, I mean, he doesn't overlook those things. I mean, Jacob reaped a lot of consequences for what he did, didn't he? But again, it shows the graciousness of our God. I can't get over it as I go through the study, all these different things, you know. So, anyway, just another thought came to mind. Go ahead, Dave.
In Hebrews 11:31, it says, by faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not when she had received the spies with peace. And so God commends her for the faith. It doesn't say anything about the lies. It was her faith and what little light she had.
Right.
But it was enough.
That's right. Amen.
Because it was in the person, it was in who that faith was. It was God.
That's right. Exactly. Right. Well, thank you for your comments. Appreciate it. And I hope as we go along, you'll feel more confident to be able to share, because we'd like to do that in a sense to kind of review this way, to see what you're getting out of it as well. That helps me to know how it's being beneficial to you. Okay? Thank you very much. Lord willing, we'll see you Sunday.